Those on Earth received the message of Broken Arrow and were concerned, very much so. They use this phrase. It is something that was once in common use, but the Xenos didn't know this, as Broken Arrow itself has modified itself over the years. Originally, it meant that you were surrounded completely, and you required as much reinforcement as possible in order to survive. More recently, it's been used to let you know that you are in trouble and that you have massive weapons on the loose. You don't know what's going to happen, but you know something is about to happen, and soon. Now is an amalgamation of these two. The Broken Arrow signal was sent to let humanity know to prepare, as they knew they would be surrounded on all sides, and they knew that these species would be like a lost nuclear weapon. It's going to go off, it's going to hurt, and you have no idea where or when it's going to strike. You just know that it's going to be soon, and you had no choice but to be ready. And that is why they received Broken Arrow. The delegation took about 7 weeks to return, a little bit more than 7 weeks actually, as the distance in space that needed to be traveled was extremely vast. As one person said, space is not just vast, it is vastly vast, and should never be underestimated about that. As the delegation finally made it back to Earth space, they realized that things had been started. Preparations had begun well in advance before they even got there. They knew that some of the preparations had started just in case, as in the deconstruction of ships and the analysis of all their weaponry, vessels, engines, and pretty much anything else they possibly could. They knew that they needed something, anything, to be ready to fight off whatever else might be coming. They knew that there was no rules of war anymore, and they had to be ready. As the delegation ship flew closer and closer to the planet, they could see that many things had already taken place. Deep in space, they could see many, many satellites now wrapped around Earth in almost a strange cocoon, in a way that made sure that nothing was going to get through unscathed. They could see a new type of weapon systems that were on there, along with what seemed to be old technology. Your basic mass driver, i.e. railgun, was situated right near the center, right next to another type of weapon. They didn't know what it was, but it looked strangely like one of the cannons that they had faced before. These energy cannons were not exactly something to be trifled with. Very dangerous, but they knew they could not be fired indefinitely, as the energy itself would simply melt down the barrel if you did so. Flanked on all four sides was just racks and racks of missiles. They knew that this was going to be essential to swarming all the enemy vessels to try and knock them out. As they got closer, they could also see that the moon itself was being prepared for war. Cannons were being strapped all different sides. They could see the different colonies that stretched from one side of the moon to the other. Though these were not very vast buildings, they knew that humanity does something that humanity always does in this situation. They dig in, and they dig in very, very deep. Along with those, they could see massive shipyards that had been rapidly constructed. Though they were only making what looked like destroyer class, there was a single one that was there building a very, very large vessel. Everybody worried about how they were going to get enough resources, but then they saw a different type of station that was off just outside of lunar orbit. This was not alone either, as there were over a dozen stretched across the entire vastness of space. These were collection stations. These were to take the ore taken from not only the Oort cloud, but also the asteroid belt, and refine them, and bring the materials over to the shipyard so that they could create the vessels they would need to protect themselves. This was something that made the delegation smile, and in some cases made them chuckle. Seeing this let them know that even if humanity may fall, those bastards on the other side are going to know they're going to be in a fight for damn sure, as they'll make sure that they lose so many vessels and personnel that any victory tastes as bitter as any defeat. Once penetrating the atmosphere and gliding in, they could see the preparations down onto Earth were definitely taking place. In fact, in some cases, it looked like the Earth had not changed, this being mostly agricultural areas, which were pumping out food at absolute full tilt. But what looked very different was the built up industry. There were entire areas, entire cities that had been completely reconstructed in the 2 years that it took before the trial took place. They had gotten everything ready, and now they could see that not only that they were building large weapon emplacements right next to them, but these industries were building vehicles and, surprisingly, more ships. Along with that, they were building all sorts of other machines that would be used in the future conflict they knew was going to be coming. This, again, made the delegation laugh as they got ready to land. Looking across the scape that they saw, it was no longer the city that they knew, but no, everything had been refit. Everything was ready. Some of the skyscrapers even had fixed emplacements towards the top. Some of the buildings were actually not really buildings to be habitated. However, these were giant weapon emplacements that were hidden from sight. Once they fired, it wouldn't be so much, but never, ever underestimate first strike capabilities, and they all knew this. They all looked across and, unfortunately, held their head low when they told everyone that they had failed. They had failed to make sure that humanity would be left the hell alone, and that a conflict was imminent. Everyone already understood that this was going to happen, as for the past 2 to 2.5 years, they had already started rebuilding, putting everything together and throwing away old rivalries just so they could survive. And what they had accomplished thanks to having a mutual enemy was astounding. Along with that was the increase in alien technology, along with technologies that had been hidden from the general population for 70, 80, 90 years. Along with that, standard ingenuity to put them both together. But the biggest difference that was easy to see was the introduction of robotics. Massive numbers of robots toiled endlessly, only stopping to recharge unless they were hooked up to something. They helped build so much, and it was commonplace for everyone to have their own personal assistant. Though some people obviously wanted the outer shell to look more and more human, as this made them more comfortable, it was still very noticeable that at least 50% of the population now was not organic. This they knew would play a lot into the coming battle, which they did not know when was coming, but the sensor arrays were always watching, always looking for the introduction of new signals. They were scanning the entire universe all the way out to the other side, looking for any type of movement. They knew they'd be able to pick up, even with their rudimentary sensors, a large group of vessels. They knew that when they were going to be hit, it was going to be by a large group after humanity had basically bent over the previous group and taught them in a bad way that you do not screw with humanity. They knew that everyone would be coming, and when they came, they would be rolling extremely deep. It would be just under 26 months later that the battle finally reached humanity. And if anyone understood humanity, they would have known immediately, never give humans time to prepare for a battle, or they are going to end you in bad, bad ways. The approaching fleet was nothing to scoff at. Several thousand different vessels, from something as small as a large van, or maybe a Winnebago, all the way up to huge battleships that could almost be considered dreadnoughts. They looked at humanity and seemed to scoff as they came down not only to invade, but to truly conquer, mixing several dozen different species altogether. Yet there was one surprisingly absent: the original invaders. They were the only ones that said they wanted nothing to do with humanity. They were done. They had lost too many ships and too many personnel to the absolute batshit insanity that was humanity itself. And they even warned all the others to never, ever go there. After losing their ambassador to a simple heart attack due to fear, they realized that humanity was not something they wanted. The rest of the council decided they would send their main fleets, though they would leave their defense fleets behind. Their main assault fleets would all combine and assault humanity, and off they went. When they arrived inside the Sol sector, everyone had already known they were coming. Everyone had reported to their action stations immediately and got ready. All weapons had already begun to prime themselves, and the enemy realized this as soon as they came in. They believed humanity to be nothing but pitchfork-wielding hairless monkeys. Well, they didn't expect humanity to refit all their ships as soon as possible. They didn't expect humanity to be able to break down and figure out how to build their own ships so quickly, as they believed humanity was barely a spacefaring race. They had saw what broken down piece of shit that the emissaries had actually showed up in during their original trial. They believed that humanity will be an easy victory. By their own laws, they declared the war before they even got within the orbit of 2 planetoids away. This actually put them surprisingly close, yet far enough away that nobody could get any accurate shots off just yet. Not without using guided munitions, that was. They declared that humanity now belonged to them, their territory, their ships, their resources, and even their personnel would be divided amongst those species that stood against them. If they refuse this, there would be a trial, but this time it'll be a trial by fire. They sent this message and received a simple message less than a few minutes later. It was simply, "Then you can burn, motherfuckers." They didn't understand this, and why would they set a hold of themselves if they were mating their maternal figure? This didn't sit well, but they understood by the tone that this was an act of defiance. So the fleet simply moved in, spreading itself all the way around, covering at least half of the area that the Earth would be facing. Basically, the entire light side of the planet. They moved in closer and closer, believing humanity would send out their forces to try and protect the home planet, and they would be able to pick off humanity's forces easily. But surprisingly, humanity didn't send out its forces. In fact, many of their ships simply ran to the other side of the planet. Most of the species simply laughed and joked at how pathetic this was. Maybe they were trying to get away from the planet. All they could read was the vastness of the engines pushing them well beyond what they should be doing. However, they believed that this was simply a rescue mission as they were abandoning their planet. As they got close, just outside of lunar orbit, they all began to ready their weapons as they were almost in primary firing range for their mass drivers. As the mass drivers were usually the first things fired, as they would be sacrificial pieces of, well, anything that they were made of, to simply drain the enemy forces of their ammunition and also to show their hand to where their actual weapons emplacements were. Then they received the biggest shock. They believed that certain asteroids, certain meteors, certain chunks of rock were simply floating in space and would bounce off the hull. Then suddenly these chunks of rocks exploded with a massive ball of light. If they were anywhere close to the ship that they exploded by, the ship would be launched several thousand meters per second in one direction, turning everyone inside into goo, bending the hull, in many cases burning up the side of the hull to the point where something would explode, usually the atmosphere, and the ship itself would blow. They didn't understand what was happening, and then another and another and another. It was almost like a daisy chain of fireworks as they simply began to blow up inside the enemy forces. They started taking down 1 or 2 flagships of species, this causing the rest of them to be either totally freaked out or totally pissed off. Either way, they began to go full burn towards the planet. No one withdrew because they knew if they withdrew, it would bring complete shame to their species, and they would be the next one on trial. And if they were, they would lose everything. Because of this, they were all in, and they watched almost 20% of their forces be damaged or destroyed before they even got into effective firing range for the mass drivers. And while this was going on, they received another shock. The satellites. The satellites began to fire. Not only that, but there was a large buildup of energy coming from this single moon around that planet. What the hell was that? Without even knowing what was going on, suddenly a beam of reddish blue light came flying out and began to streak across the sky, going right into the largest vessel they had. The enemy fleet watched as this laser burned clean through their capital ship, cutting it, but not totally breaking it in half. Though it wouldn't be able to get anywhere close to a gravity well, still it was enough that over half of their crew was now dead, either burned up by the laser, spaced, or simply died from rapid decompression before the safety barriers got into place. The bulkheads can only be shifted so fast, the doors can only close so fast, the hatches can only shut so quick. And with that, they watched again as another beam came out. Several of the ships close by began to fire on the moon itself, trying to take out that weapon, which, to their delight, only took a few shots, and the weapon was silent completely. As they got closer, they suddenly realized it wasn't the only one. 3 more strike true and started to tear apart the fleet, and with that, the enemy fleet did a full bombardment of the moon. The moon went silent less than a minute later, but the damage had been done, as most of the largest ships they had taken massive damage. Any ship that had been swiped across by these heated particle beams was simply cut. In moments, part of it was sliced clean off. In a few cases, were cut clean in half. Or, in one particular case, went stem to stern, going from the thrusters, giving it a space enema as it burst through the front. This made everybody realize that they definitely had a foe they could not even come close to underestimating. So they began to charge down. They were given the order to get down to the surface and take them out as soon as possible. To make an example of any other upstart species, they needed to take this planet and its people. But as they began to move, they got another surprise. The satellites. The satellites began to spam fire out every single missile and or torpedo it might have. Along with that, the main guns began to fire constantly back and forth. The mass driver cannons, i.e. rail guns, were firing as fast as they could be reloaded. In fact, it was enough that it would shift the satellite a little bit, sometimes forcing its particle beam shots to go wide. It didn't matter. The satellites were automated, and they were going to go until they were either destroyed or they were destroyed. Either way, the enemy knew what they had to do. At severe losses, they'd go straight for the satellites and begin to fire as well. Unfortunately for them, most of their point defenses and medium-range weapons were being used up trying to deflect all the missiles and torpedoes coming in. As the missiles and torpedoes went in, they began to split off into several sections. It turned out that these were a MIRV-style missile. They would fire out 10, 12, 14 of their own different smaller missiles designed specifically to bore into the hull and then explode inside. Many of the species attacking watched in horror as one of their sister ships was hit, and then a moment later there was a massive explosion from the inside as the ball of fire rippled through the entire ship itself, many times buckling the entire hull of the ship. And they would sit there in horror knowing that their comrades just died in a very messy and violent fashion. What made this even more difficult is many of the alien forces decided that they would target the shipyards. The shipyards were not armed, they were simply shipyards. So they were easy to take out, but they were the largest target. which made them think that they were definitely going to be firing at them. But while they were busy with the shipyards, they were getting tore up from the floor up, all the way top to bottom, left to right, as the satellites continued to fire. But it wasn't long until the satellites were simply out of munitions, and they were simply down to their particle lasers, which continued to fire as fast as possible. But it was clear they were overheating. Even by the naked eye, you could see that they were glowing. And if they were not shot by the approaching forces, they simply overheated and exploded, sending shrapnel all over the place. This was also anticipated. What they didn't understand is that the front of each of these was designed to be like an EFP, an explosively formed penetrator. The explosion from each of the satellites would send certain pieces of metal rocketing towards the enemy fleet. They couldn't understand it. They just knew that their sensors were picking up debris. But this debris was shaped and coming at them in speeds that their sensors couldn't understand. This wasn't a bullet. Why wasn't it giving a warning signal? And then, bam, right through the hull, usually breaking the outer hull, possibly the inner hull, forcing more of the damage control teams to go absolutely nuts as more of their ship was being torn apart around them. With this, over 57% of the fleet was done already. They didn't have the ability to even reach the surface, even if they tried. They didn't have weapons enough anymore to take down anything on the planet. But now was where everything was going to get very, very interesting. They began to head towards the planet itself, using an orbital bombardment on many of the areas they believed to be built up specifically for weapon emplacements. But as they did, they got return fire from the surface itself. The massive anti-ship cannons that were on the planet began to fire, and they were incredibly accurate. These massive cannons were not easy to take out either, as many of the orbital bombardments simply broke up as they went through the ionosphere and then through the atmosphere, breaking more and more their beams apart. The only thing they could hit them with that was even close to effective was mass driver cannons. But with the simple spin of the Earth and the high gravity, it pulled most of their shots off target. This meant that they had to volley fire into each of the cannons, wasting more and more time as the cannons continued to target them. And even as they did this, several rounds of missiles came flying up from the surface. Unfortunately for the humans, it wasn't in a volley heavy enough that they would do much damage. Once they silenced the cannons, they were down, losing over 61%. This was insane for all of them, but it filled them with a rage and a determination to take down humanity no matter the cost, even if it meant that half of their fleet was already floating debris, with many bodies simply drifting in space, going down towards the planet and turning into flaming debris as they tumbled through. As they broke through the atmosphere, the only ships that stayed up above were the ships too large to actually land on this planet. But there was only one left. And with that, they've realized something a little too late. This was the same ship that had been strafed by the moon itself. They realized that it would have a lot of trouble if it got any closer. So it had to stay back. But with that, they realized that they could still have enough forces to take this planet. And each of the ships broke through the atmosphere simultaneously, firing at anything as soon as it came out, and there was plenty to shoot at. The sky was filled with munitions, dumb munitions, rockets, missiles, everything. Electromagnetic pulse weapons of any sort were being fired at these ships as they came through. Many of them launched shuttles, transports, and drop pods as soon as they could, and those were being tore up as well. It was a slaughter on both sides as each side began to fire every weapon they had. Those on the ground were being hit from above. Those in the sky were being hit from below. It was utter pandemonium and chaos. Everyone on the ground began to move as they realized that fixed positions were a very, very bad idea. They would shoot, move, call in for everyone else. It was a constant shoot, move, and communicate with the command to try and see where the next shot should go. It didn't matter. More and more was moving. The freighters The frigates, the destroyers all came to the ground, firing as many weapons as they could, but as soon as they lost the ability to stay in the air, they became weapons themselves as the ships began to plummet towards the planet. Many of them twisting, turning, and burning up as they came through the atmosphere. Others trying desperately to pull up out of the dive. If they could, they would slide across the land, tearing everything apart for kilometers. If they couldn't pull up, the massive explosion was akin to Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was destruction at a level no one had seen in a long, long time. Humanity had never actually seen a war this bad. Yes, they knew this was exactly what was going on, as they had seen their warfare expand from simple rocks and sticks to nuclear weapons. They knew this was going to be all sorts of hell. On the ground, as those that made it to the surface began to depart, they began to fire at anything, any type of fauna that was on the planet. They didn't care about the flora, even though they did hit it with some sort of flamethrower, some sort of plasma cannon that they were using to set everything on fire. If they came across a building, that was the first thing they did, was hit it with fire, as they believed humans would be fearful of fire. And they found out real quick that humans had been busy making sure that this was not going to be a problem, as many of them charged out in full body armor, still ablaze, yet this time they were blazing away with their ballistic weapons. Some of them had energy-based weapons, but those energy-based weapons were extremely short range. This meant that most of them only carried them as sidearms, but their long guns, oh, their long guns, the kinetic weapons, were more than enough to take care of most species. Most species had not used kinetic weapons in a long time, so they did not have body armor accustomed to it. But instead, they had body armor attuned for energy weapons. Though they would keep them fine from energy weapons, the ballistic slugs would go clean through and tear apart all their organs. And it seemed as though humanity had this strange idea that not just shoot once, but no, just keep shooting, no matter how many rounds they put in, no matter how many dead they piled up, no matter how dead someone was. It was a custom for them to just constantly fire and fire and fire until they heard a satisfying click. Where they seemed to run out of ballistic ammo, they would simply drop the container that the ammo came in, reload another one, and just keep going. Those on the ground facing the humans found themselves not only aiming at ballistic weapons, but they also had to deal with humans who were crazy enough to come at them. They had run out of ships, now they're using guns. They ran out of guns, and then they used their sticks and knives and bare hands. It was absolute insanity. These kamikaze flying monkeys, as they jumped out of windows onto each of the Xenos, it didn't matter if they thought they could win or not. It didn't matter, man, woman, or child. Even the youngest walked up with a small little knife and stabbed one of the Grinka in the leg. The Grinka couldn't even barely feel it. It looked down, kicked the child, but when it looked up, it realized it might have screwed up as a huge human stood over it, swinging its massive paw and crushing the Grinka's skull right there. Everyone was absolutely petrified as they realized that they had definitely kicked the nest, walked into the lion's den, or whatever other phrase you want to do, but every single species has an adaptation to this, and they realized that their forces were being taken out too fast. Even the ships that landed were catching some sort of ordnance that would come over the hills. Some of it was fired so close they couldn't figure out what was going on, but they couldn't get a direct line of sight. They just knew the ordnance was coming in, and then explosions would happen on the hull, sometimes striking one of the weapons emplacements and forcing it to explode. It was insane, as though the humans didn't care how many they lost, as long as they killed the Xenos that had made it to their shores. It was even worse for those that tried to take over the water, as there were certain type of aquatic animals that seemed to enjoy hunting down the Xenos themselves. Along with that, large metal tubes would fire directly into the ships that landed there. The ships were not really designed for water combat. They were simply trying to use it as a base of operations, and yet suddenly this explosion from underneath would happen. They would begin to search, but they didn't have the equipment anymore to actually search for them. Their sensors were designed for space, not for water. Though once they attuned their sensors, they could figure out what was going on, but it was already too late. They were taking on water, and their ship would not be able to generate enough thrust to get them out of the water, and the ship would simply sink towards the bottom. Those that tried desperately to get away would find themselves being accosted by a whole bunch of aquatic beasts. These things would come up many times, seeming to play by touching them, bumping them, and trying to get these creatures away. They would splash the water as hard as they could, trying desperately to seem more vicious, and this seemed to only make the creatures more hungry. By the end of the 6th day, they realized they could not take humanity, not without destroying the entire planet, but they didn't have enough ships to do that. They simply ordered the retreat, the withdrawal of everyone. If they had to leave their forces, but within an hour of the retreat, they had to get their ships back into the air. Any of those that could fly had to go. They had to get off this world, this death world, this hell world that they were in. Many of them closed the doors immediately and began to turn on their engines. Screw the hour waiting. They were going to get the hell out of there. They had taken far too many hits, far too much damage. They couldn't take any more. They wouldn't be able to take off. But as they began to turn on their motors, their own people came up, waving at them, in some cases shooting at them, desperate for them to open the cargo doors so they could actually get in and get some sort of safety. But as the Xenos began to retreat, humanity began to charge even harder. During all this time, the Xenos had found out that humanity was not just organic, but they were also facing an inorganic humanity that was just as vicious, just as hesitant to stop with the pain. They could shoot many, many times, and it wouldn't stop unless they were able to break through and their energy weapons were actually able to hit the delicate circuitry inside. If that was the case, the inorganic ones would fall easily, but they would have to hit it several times for that to happen. The ones who were organic would simply say, ow, and then just keep coming at them. It was horrific. And as the ships began to pull out, the last remaining dreadnought had repaired itself enough to cover their retreat and began to fire down into the surface, trying desperately to keep the humans back. And then they received the worst news possible. Humanity had a fleet. Humanity had hidden on the other side of the planet and on the other side of the moon. They were waiting. They were waiting for this moment to close the trap. They knew they couldn't risk their fleet because they didn't know how well they would perform. Yet everyone was well disciplined. Everyone was looking for a fight, and everybody wanted to kill some Xeno scum. As the fleet began to show itself, the Xenos received one simple message which seemed to be the signal for the fleet to advance. "Welcome to my home," said the spider to the fly. To an insectoid species, once they understood the translation, many of them simply started to shake in fear. The dreadnought itself forgot it needed to cover its own forces and began to face off against the closest bunch of human ships. These destroyers went full bore straight towards the enemy, using all their thrusters to maneuver about, and began to fire as soon as they could. They fired all sorts of missiles and torpedoes as soon as they were able to get them within range, and it was a massacre, an absolute massacre. The human battleships had massive mass drivers ready to rock and roll and began to fire immediately as soon as they got direct line of sight. If a single one of those hit any of the destroyers or frigates trying to make their way out of the atmosphere, they immediately started to fall back towards the atmosphere, as most of it was now missing. With that, they also began to fire on the last dreadnought. The last dreadnought tried desperately to get away, at least far enough out of the gravity well where they could jump to FTL and try to get some sort of space away from humanity, but it wasn't enough. The swarm of destroyers that came at them like amphetamine-soaked circus monkeys, firing full-on machine guns. Every single weapon that could be used was being used as they unloaded on the enemy fleet. Those trying desperately to leave started calling for some sort of mercy. And some of those started to ask, "Do we take prisoners?" The fleet admiral simply replied, I don't. And with that, the fire continued until every single one of the ships was either stuck on the surface or simply a floating, burning wreck in space. And with that, the battle for humanity was over. They had won not only their trial in court, but their trial by fire. Humanity didn't celebrate right away, as there were still remnants of those still on the planet, many of them begging for their lives as their brains were blown out the back of their heads. The only one that was hesitated was a simple species that looked very, very similar to humanity. So much so that they started to wonder. It was strange. This species was almost like a homunculus. They were only 60% the standard height of humanity. Though this was standard across the board for all other species as far as height, this was odd, and they wanted a little more information. But very few of them, only 0.3% survived and were taken in for interrogation. All other Xenos, well, that really depended on who stuck the weapon in their face, whether they wanted them to survive or not. In several cases, the Xenos who begged for mercy still had fresh human blood on their talons or their spikes or their fangs or whatever type of manipulators or weapons they have. Their calls for mercy fell on deaf ears as they were all slaughtered in horrible, horrible ways. The last holdouts known, at least any of significant size, were inside a city in Brazil. They cried for mercy, yet they still continued to fire at anyone who tried to approach them, and it was decided what they would do. Many of the humans snuck up, and using their own version of a plasma thrower that everyone knows as a flamethrower, simply used one simple battle cry. Burn, you motherfuckers! As the whole place was set ablaze. Many of the Xenos tried to run from the flames themselves. They couldn't get deeper in as they knew that the building itself would eventually fall on them. They tried to climb but realized that fire goes up and eventually they would be blasted as they tried to jump for safety. They either burned to death or were burning as they jumped. Many times, those on the ground would simply scream in whatever language they spoke, "Don't shoot! Let 'em burn!" 19 days later, those who had held humanity on trial received a message. It was a very simple message. We need to talk.